Welcome back, everybody. And yes, and we're moving along with our conference in a beautiful way now. And our next speaker is somebody I'm honored and delighted to introduce to you, and to introduce to you. Her name is Solana Booth. Mark and I did an interview with Solana recently, and we just came off of that interview going, wow, what a bright spirit, what knowledge, what insight, and so many things that Solana is doing. She is a Native American woman from Washington State, promotes Native American and Alaskan traditional teachings using multiple modalities, such as traditional canoe family skipper, ancient knowings, traditional ceremonies, traditional medicine keeper, and far too many other activities to cover here. She's a powerful force for good in the world with a huge warm heart. Her talk is titled Remembering Mother's Breath. Please welcome Solana Booth, clapping at your own computer. Solana.
Now aqualis cloak othsiam, aiskotalchi siayasiam, ishjanewaji dewayu, nuksak mohaka bequent delwatku, Beatrice Anderson, Samuel George, Violet Atkinson, William Booth, Delawanuth. Timukochi chante tanaguz nalak suida. I will miam dimagwalt nelawan. From the heart of the prairie to the heart of the ocean, the universe sings to my soul, and I'm honored to be with you today. It is in radical humility and prayers that I'm with you to share some aduklanath, some ancestral tellings, some knowings, in hopes that the spirit of the plant medicine can find its way back to us in a good way for healing, for Mother Earth, and for ourselves. Good to be with you. I'm going to share my screen and just show a little bit more about of the work. Okay, I'm freezing for some reason. I'll figure that out in a minute. And I just wanted to preface today's talk with, we're going to go into a story, a creation story, in hopes that this story wakes up the spirit of not only the plant medicine, but the spirit of the human family. The spirit of the human family is the same as Mother Earth. The people, we are made of the fire and the water and the air and the minerals, just as Mother Earth. And the evidence is outside and it's inside of us. And we can tell and we can check that fact when something makes us sad or something makes us mad or we're elated. The water in our bodies can boil, or it can freeze, or it moves quite rapidly at times. And the only element that can calm that water is our breath. And it's the same outside. It's the same outside as the only element that can move and manipulate water is air. So I invite you to go outside and check that fact at some point. I invite you to, when you're walking in the woods or taking a hike or even walking down the streets. Thankfully in the Northwest, we have a lot of trees and we have a lot of greenery. I invite you to notice those trees and notice those plants next time you're walking around. And uh-oh. We are, nope. Still not letting me share just the PowerPoint. Sorry about that, people. It's right here. Try it one more time. Okay, here we are. Slide. Here we go. We're up and going. So the name of today's discussion and today's story and my message with the Spirit of the Plant Medicine Conference is Remembering Mother's Breath. And this is really important to me because remembering Mother's Breath has to do with my own lineage, and it has to do with recovery from generational trauma for the Black, Indigenous, people of color, for LGBTQ, for the human family. And right now there's an urgency to advocate and protect our plants. There's an urgency to remember these stories and find artifacts that can prove how closely we were related to these plants that some people call psychedelics or some people call entheogens, these plants that cause us to make a shift to modify our behavior, these plants that just do a whole lot of work for us soon as we partner with them. I'm going to invite folks to imagine what a true partnership could look like. I'm going to invite you to imagine an authentic relationship. I'm going to invite you to imagine how beautiful and how much service you can provide with that partner. And so this story is an ancient story. This story is an ancient story as it goes back to around the time of the Great Flood. And I'll tell the story a little bit later. I'm just going to keep prefacing with different parts of the story because this traditional story has to do with my advocacy. It has to do with my family's advocacy. It has to do with the Indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest, up and down the Northwest coast. It has to do with our relationship to these plants. And I want to invite folks to reframe and, again, be radical in your imagination when it comes to your relationship to Mother Earth. And so stories are super important to my people, to my family. Stories is what has helped us become who we are as a society today. Advocates of Sacred is my organization, and we have written multiple curriculums using first narratives, understanding and reinterpreting our traditional stories to not only help us be human, but to disseminate racism, to advocate for intimate partner, healthy relationships, to advocate for mother and baby attachment, to advocate for pregnant people and their young families, and first foods and plant medicines. And so Indigenous people from all over, every single tribe of the human family has been employing our first narratives since before the written word. And there's a lot of cultures and even some religions that use first narratives or traditional creation stories. Speaking on behalf of my people, of the Indigenous people, of the Tsimshian people, the Mohawk Abequint people, the Nooksack people, the mountain people, the wild ones of Washington State, when we would share our stories with one another, when we would employ those teachings or those lessons or those remindings of those stories, we had no prisons. We had no police. We had no racism. There was no exploitation of any sorts. There was no overusage of our natural resources. We had no shortage either. We had no birth outcomes. And most importantly, we had no mental, spiritual, emotional, or physical dis-ease. These stories and our sacred breath combined allowed us to not only feel an inner peace or an inner freedom, it allowed us to stay true to the natural law that we see outside on Mother Earth. And that shows us that the fruit is not jealous of the leaf that's on the tree prior to its existence. The leaf is not jealous of the fruit that's coming, even though the leaf dies. The berries that are coming, there's no envy of the different berries, of the different flavors. There's no envy among the four-leggeds, among the wingeds. There's no objectification of the wingeds, of the four-leggeds, of the trees, of these beautiful, vulnerable plants, of these precious flowers. There's none of that happening outside. There's only a lot of respect, a lot of autonomous growth, and a lot of sharing, a lot of generosity, a lot of service. And so these stories touch on that protocol. These stories touch on the protocol of how to be a family, of how to take care of one another in our homes, of how to take care of our children and our grandchildren. And correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of folks go into this plant medicine. They need psilocybin, they need ayahuasca, they need these sacred plants. They need that partnership with them for healing. And once again, they're creating their own stories. And once again, they're trying to remember their highest self. They're seeking their highest self. They're wanting to partner with the sacred plant, which is Mother's breath. Okay, I'm going to stop share. And I'm going to go into the story in just a few minutes. Prior to the story, again, I wanted to touch on a little bit more protocol. I'm really trying to build up the story because the story has been teaching me so many things, has been teaching Solana, my family, my children, my work. I have partners all over the North American continent and now on different continents as well. And these stories are what people are craving. These stories are what people are after. And so I had to jump on this call today, this invitation to speak at the Spirit of Plant Medicine conference in hopes to share what Mother's breath is, in hopes to remind people to remember her breath. Okay. So before we go into the story, I just want to share some reminders about our mother. For some folks, our mothers are the ones that carried us in their womb. And for some folks, our mothers are the ones that surrendered us for adoption. For some folks, their mothers are a mystery to us. And I invite you to consider the fact that you and your mother have at least two things in common, that whoever grew you in their tummy, that you share two things in common with them, that you share being born, so she birthed you, and you share the cutting of that umbilical cord. Those first two traumas is what you can build a relationship on. Those first two traumas is what will forever connect you to the idea of being cared for, of being provided for, of seeking your highest self, of growth, of connection, of the water. There's a reason why you enjoy the water. There's a reason why you want to go into this plant medicine. There's a reason why you're aching for that healing, or you're aching to heal others. There's a reason why, and it started with those first two traumas. So I work in the abstract and unproven, kind of ethereal and profound realm among the people, among my family. And I've accepted that. These stories help me relate to my family. These stories, they're invented and sometimes nonsensical, and Some of them, maybe they never happened, but at the heart of the center, they're all true because they show us how to adapt or modify our behavior as a human family. They show us certain rules and protocol to stay connected in our truth or seek our highest self. We're made of the same elements, again, of Mother Earth. I'm just reminding you: air, fire, water, minerals. When we hear them or when we tell them, we're employing that same sacred breath that our mother breathed for us to grow in her tummy, in utero. We're employing that exact breath. If we can imagine and believe that some of these stories really happened or wish they had, then that's something to build on. The mind is a powerful thing. And those of us that have went into these plants, those of us that have partnered with the psilocybin mushroom, that have partnered with the ayahuasca, with the peyote, that have partnered with all these sacred plants, with Mother's Breath, we know how powerful our minds are. We know how strong our spirit can be. And so this story, I'm hoping, will remind us to share some of that love back to Mother Earth, to share and acknowledge her breath and everything it does for us, how it helps us grow. So I just want to invite folks to, I'm going to close this screen and invite you to take a deep breath. And I invite you to close your eyes, and that's okay if you don't. I'm going to begin this story. The story starts long, long ago in Tootie-Too-Hawk. So when I say long ago, I'm meaning before computers, before radio, before television, before the written word. It was so long ago, in fact, that sometimes folks communicated without their mouth. Sometimes folks didn't always speak to one another with words. Sometimes we can just feel each other, and we knew. So the story is from that long ago. These people, they had a special protocol. These people, they lived in a special way. This village, this people, this community of indigenous, they traveled with the seasons of the year. So at certain times of the year, they would be by the river. At certain times of the year, they would be farther down by the valley. At certain times of the year, it just depended on what was happening outside. It depended on what the people needed for their homes, for each other. It depended on what resources they needed to gather. It depended on when the berries were ready. So you can say that these people had a really strong relationship with Mother Earth. You can say that these people were living the best they could. And one day, the chief of the people, he was blessed. He was so very blessed. He received his daughter, his beautiful, precious daughter. And that same day, he lost his wife. Because she died in childbirth, the chief and the people had to come even closer together to help his daughter, to help tell her those stories about her mom, in hopes that she would remember her mom, in hopes that she would remember how special and precious she was. That's what mothers did back then. That's what they did for us. You could say that the people were emulating what Mother Earth does for us, the way they cared for this precious girl, the way they told her these stories about her mom singing and her mom harvesting and foraging for food for the family, about her mom's weaving, her masterful weaving of cedar bark and partnering with the cedar trees. So this young girl grew up listening to these stories of her mom. When she first started to speak and use her words to the people, she talked about her mom as if she was around all the time. She talked about remembering her mother's heartbeat. She talked about stories that the people didn't tell her. It's as if this young girl was still very connected to the spirit of her mother. It's as if this young girl was very much awake in generosity, awake in humility, awake in such a divine wisdom that sometimes she drove the people a little bit crazy. Sometimes the people didn't want to hear about her mother. And that was okay. That was okay with the little girl. As the young girl got older, she began to sense things that were going to happen. She began to sense, exactly when the berries would be ready. She began to sense what kind of teas to prepare. She began to feel the salmon as they were coming back home. And people noticed her and her connection. Until one day, the little girl decided to share that a big fire was coming. She decided to share that a big fire was going to come and it was going to wreak havoc on the people, that people might lose our longhouses, that we might lose our canoes, we might lose our food, our livelihood. And this was difficult for her to share with the people. It was difficult for her to share what she was seeing in her mind, what she was seeing in her heart. She was truly convicted with this vision. She was so convicted that she begged her father and she begged some workers around the village to help build her a chamber. And so finally, to appease her, to make her happy and satisfied, of course, the chief's daughter, she got her chamber. As she got her chamber, she began to stockpile it with certain goods. And that vision of the fire just kept coming. That vision of the fire taking away her family just kept coming. And she just kept calling for her mom. She kept calling for her mom. And this little girl began to feel emotions that she hadn't felt before. She began to feel like anxiety or worry. She began to feel confused. She was confused because the people, even her father, weren't adhering to her warning. They weren't taking her seriously. That caused her to be confused. She had never been confused before that. Still, just like the memory of her mother's breath, she was convicted. She was convicted about the fire that was coming. It was getting close to fall time. It was getting close to the salmon coming back home. It was getting close to around that time because at this time of the year, the little girl was joyful. She was excited. She seemed even more motivated about life. She began to sing some of her mother's songs to the people. She wanted to bring them back for the people. Ultimately, she wanted them to take her seriously in her vision of the fire that was coming. She thought, maybe if I get my mom's song down, maybe they'll believe me. You see, at that time, no one was teaching her her mother's song. There's a whole nother creation story about songs and how important they are to the people. There's a whole list of protocols that go along with bringing a family song out. There's a lot of work that has to be done when you do that. And as the salmon were coming home, the little girl's feelings and emotions were getting so strong about this fire that was coming, and this fire was coming for sure. So she went into her chamber and she locked herself underground in her chamber. She just didn't come out for probably 10 days or so. By the 10th day, when she came out of her chamber, there was no one there. She could smell burnt houses. She could smell an awful stench of foods or loved ones that had passed on. There was mostly ashes, and she could feel the warmth of the fire that had already burned out. Devastated and utterly alone, she began to grieve. She began to feel ultimate sadness. She began to feel the pain, these senses in her body that were uncomfortable. She had never felt a physical pain before this. This pain was coming from where her belly button was. This pain, these senses of uncomfortable sensations in her body would go up her back, up her shoulders. Throughout feeling this pain, throughout feeling these aches, her mother's song was still there. Her mother's song was still coming to her in her mind. She was thankful for the food she had in her chamber. And she knew that it wouldn't last. She knew that she needed help. She knew that she was not completely grown up yet. There was no more cedar trees for her to gather bark and weave a coat. There was no more plants or roots to dig for to sustain herself. She knew that she needed help. Every day she would go to the river and cry and cry and cry and cry, and she would sing remnants of her mother's song. She would sing the parts that were coming to her really strong. She couldn't wait for the salmon to come back. She couldn't wait to feel them again. She wondered when that was. Because of her being underground for 10 days, she kind of lost which time of the year it was. She kind of had a hard time figuring out what the people would have been doing at this time. She couldn't help but remember her auntie's laugh and her little cousin's jokes and curious attitudes towards her when she would talk about her mother that wasn't there. She couldn't help but remember the embrace of her father, those hugs, those tender moments. She would bring all those memories to the river, and she would cry and cry and cry and grieve and grieve and grieve. She noticed and she heard and she felt, finally the salmon are coming home. Finally the salmon are coming back. And up the river they came. Up the river they came, and the Chum King came to greet her. You see, as all of this was happening, just like today, as all of this was happening, the salmon, they were aware of the fire. They were aware of the devastation that these people suffered. The Chum King was already talking to the other salmon, and he was letting them know that he needs to go help this young person. He needs to go help this girl. He needs to go see what he can do for her. He met her at the river, and he invited her to go with him. He invited her to go with him, to be his wife, to partner with him. He wanted to show her the river. He wanted to show her how to adapt into the ocean, from fresh water to salt water. He explained how many moons that would take. He explained exactly how cold and how comforting the water is at times. He explained all the feelings, all the emotions that they get to swim in. He explained all the bigger mammals that are out there after them. He explained how sometimes the people, they fish for him. He explained how to get away from them. He explained how when they come back home to spawn, sometimes the bears are after them. He explained their own protocol as to how when they do go back home, they have to tell the cedar trees everything they got to learn, everything they got to see. He was explaining all of this to the girl. He was explaining all of this because she was asking for that, because he invited her to go with her, and she went. She went with him. They became married. They traveled and they adapted back into the ocean. They swam and they lived together in their schools, in their families of salmon. And pretty soon, the Chum King and the young woman, they had 28 children. Pretty soon, they had been together in the water for almost 48 moons. Pretty soon, this young woman who became the salmon felt ever so strongly her mother's song. She felt ever so strongly that it's time to go back home, that it's time to go back. The Chum King knew that his time with her was over. The Chum King knew that what they had was very special. You see, the Chum King learned a lot about this young woman and her mother's song. The Chum King learned a lot about the people and what they did on the land and what they did with the cedar tree people, with their relationship, with learning and following the rules of Mother Earth. This was the best partnership the Chum King could have ever wanted. As he prepared to bring her back home, as he prepared to let her go and let his 28 kids go with her, they swam a little bit extra higher up the river. They swam a little bit faster. He had her do circles sometimes and practicing her strength and endurance and her stamina. He showed her how to get away from the bears even. He showed her different tricks that the Chum King only knows. As she descended from the water with her 28 children, and she was back on land, she was right where she started again with all of her beautiful children, saying, "See you later," to the Chum King. Departing ways, she realized her children had nothing. She realized there was no resources here. She realized that everything did get burned down in that fire, and there wasn't much on the earth floor anymore. There wasn't much to harvest or forage at all. The moment she realized that, she began to cry again. She began to cry again. The Chum King had to ignore her cry this time. The salmon family, they could feel her cry, they could hear her cry, and they ignored it. Her children gathered closer to her, and they began to help her cry. As she was crying, she began to sing her mother's song as much as she could, as loud as she could this time. As she began to sing her mother's song, she began to walk. Some people say she was dancing. She began to walk. She began to dance her mother's song. As she was dancing her mother's song, she was calling back the plants. She was calling back the plants this time in a way that she could design a sustainable organization of where the plants would go. She knew about the fire this time. She knew how treacherous the fire was. She knew that people couldn't breathe in the fire and the smoke. She knew what it felt like in her body and what the fire did to her lungs, to that part of her breath. She knew about having babies. She knew what pregnant people needed. She knew that there's certain plants that will help when you have a baby in your tummy. She knew about relationships now, about marriage, about trusting community, about sharing information. So as she was singing her mother's song and dancing her mother's song, she was walking up and down the mountain and delivering plants to be in certain areas of the mountain. As she came back down into the flatter lands, into the valley, she again was singing to different plants to be of a certain service. Her children learned this song, and they learned that relationship with the plant people. Pretty soon, before her song was finished, before her mother song was finished, before the plants were completely covering Mother Earth again. Her children said and acknowledged their mother's breath. Her children praised their mother's breath, the invocation of Mother Earth's breath. You see, her children got to see and witness that creation. Her children got to see and witness her dance and her mother's song in their own mother. Her children will testify to that. And I'm going to end the story there. And quick pause. That story is from my lineage. So being a descendant of that young person who got to sing the plants back, being a descendant of that young person who knew that because of the traumas, because of the fire, because of birth, because of being born, who knew that certain plant people, certain medicines, which is mother's breath, were going to be needed. They were going to be needed at some point in time for us, for the human family to partner with, to acknowledge and respect her, to heal our spirits, to heal our birth wounds, to heal our relationships, maybe heal our interpersonal relationship with ourselves. Maybe some of these plants, some of Mother's breath, isn't just the psilocybin, the ayahuasca, the peyote, but it's osha, it's nettles, bare root, sage, sweetgrass, cedar. There's many other plant medicines that aid our partnership, to Mother Earth, that aid our partnership with ourselves, to be able to go into ceremony, to be able to truly be present when we're asking Mother for the psilocybin, when we're asking Mother for that spiritual help, when we're asking Mother to help heal others. You see, a lot of us in this work, a lot of us at this Spirited Plant Medicine Conference are helpers, are healers. And I invite you to check yourself or remind yourself or radically imagine an authentic relationship to Mother Earth, to radically imagine a reconciliation, not only to your first two traumas that I know you have, but a reconciliation to Mother Earth. So another aspect of remembering Mother's breath is to say that the human family and Mother Earth are made of the same things. We're created the same way. You see, my eyes are up here on my head. They're not on my feet for a reason. You see, my heart and my lungs are up here in my upper chest cavity, and they're not on my legs for a reason. There's a rhythm and there's an order to where the parts are on our body, just like Mother Earth. Just like Mother Earth, just like how certain rivers go into the ocean, how certain species of cedar trees grow in the Pacific Northwest, but not in certain parts of Alaska, how certain four-legged, certain animals, certain wingeds are only around certain parts of the world. They're not, all the parts of Mother Earth are not the same, just like us. We all have our very unique design, and we're made of the same things. And that means we're capable of the same things. And that means it's our job. It's our invitation to advocate for what's true. You see, to heal and move further in progression of remembering Mother's breath, of advocating for the decriminalization of these plants, is to have certain elements. And these elements are applicable to us as a human family and to Mother Earth. And that makes it true. That makes it all inclusive. That makes it extremely diverse. And so perhaps it can be added to, but none of these virtues can be taken away. None of these virtues of trust, of vulnerability, of visibility, of truth and transparency. So when we go back to that creation story, you have to know that that young girl, that young woman was motherless. And how vulnerable is that? How vulnerable is it to not have a mom? You see, for the animal kingdom, when brand new babies are born, they can't even physically be too far away from their mother or they'll die. Their system, their breathing, everything shuts down because that's how much they need their mother. And as I said in the beginning of today's engagement, some of our mothers surrendered us. Some of us have been adopted. Some of us have been in the system our entire lives. And those details can be irrelevant, because what's true is that you both suffered traumas and you're invited to reconcile with Mother Earth. You're invited to acknowledge and respect her and love her. And she just wants to be visible. She just wants us to see her without objectifying her. She just wants us to partner with her without exploiting her. She just wants us to trust her. I know from experience that when I've partnered with certain plant medicines, that they've told me to trust them. And I've heard this from many people in having ceremonies with this certain plant medicines. It's all about trust. It's all about trust. And I invite you to employ that trust and acknowledge and witness Mother Earth's visibility and how she needs that, and how she wants you to see how vulnerable she is. So you can truly feel her strength. So you can truly pay respect to her vision of you finding your highest self, her vision of you listening to your spirit, listening to your truth, and standing in that and speaking to that. So if I can leave you with some things, and then we'll do some question and answers. There we go. Oops. Okay. Healing of the spirit, healing of the plant medicine, mother's breath, healing of the people is going to require these things. And I invite you all to consider these 5 elements. You see, there has to be 5 because there's 5 species of salmon, because there's 5 parts of a creation story, because 5 is so important. 5 is so important. So these 5 elements, these 5 parts are going to be acknowledging or accepting whatever part of your own story, whatever part of Mother Earth's story that caused a frown, or that caused pain, or that caused grief, or that caused sadness. The next part is finding your elder, your helper, your witness. A lot of ceremonies need more than one person for a reason. The third part is imagine radical reconciliation to whatever moment brought you to that helper or witness, whatever moment brought you that grief. And it's the same thing for Mother Earth. Reconciliation, respect, visibility, vulnerability, and trust. Lastly is providing that service or giving back. So what can we do after the reconciliation has happened, after this transformation, after this spiritual progression, after this highest self-seeking has been found, we share that. We share that narrative. We share it with each other. We write a story, we do art, we advocate for decriminalization, we partner with more plant medicines. This is about a relationship. I've used a lot of language today, and everything has to do with the relationship to your highest self, to your spirit, to the rhythm that resonates with you. And all of that is the same for Mother Earth. And so if there's any questions, I'm going to invite you to ask. Did I put you to sleep?
Absolutely
No,
not. The opposite.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very, very,
Like, oh my God, it's really quiet.
very inspiring, Solana. Thank you so much. And also, the joy with which you deliver this kind of material. It's delightful for people. Delightful for me. Very moving, even. Excuse me. So we do have one question, Solana.
Okay.
You can hear me okay? Yeah, good.
I hear you.
Sure. The question is from Casey, and it's, what happened in your indigenous community when spiritual traditional medicine doctors cured illness spiritually through plant medicines? In other words, what do you mean that they had no mental, spiritual, emotional, or physical diseases?
I love that question. Thank you for that. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer that question. So recently, I've actually been listening to the plants and soughting after them for particular reasons and uncovering ancient plants from thousands of years ago, and then figuring out that, well, this is where Western medicine got their synthetic steroids from. However, the elements and the medicine of certain plants help aid our mental health. You see, it's not to say that pre-contact or pre-colonial times was rainbows and butterflies at all, right? Because we had our own wars, we had our own warrior society, to um, we had to barter and trade nation to nation, and sometimes it didn't go exactly well because of all the different languages, because of the abundance of resources. So there was definitely a protocol that had to be established, and sometimes people got hurt even when they were hunting an animal, even when they were off foraging. You see, ailments and injuries did happen. Disease did not. Ailments and injuries were prominent. And there's a lot of plant medicines that can be applied topically or ingested through teas or mixed into our foods that help with those ailments and injuries. The thing that traditionally we understood as indigenous people is that we heal ourselves, is that whole shamanistic idea is a little bit, it's advantageous because as a human family, our bodies heal on their own and our bodies want to heal. You see, when you cut your finger, you don't get to tell your finger to swell up, and you don't get to tell your white cells to multiply to fight infection, and you don't get to tell your skin to scab and scar. Do you see what I mean? So indigenous people, we've known that our bodies are really smart. We've known the different parts inside of our bodies and what it needs and what kind of plants um, we needed to partner with. We listened. We had an obedience and a relationship with our plant people, with Mother's Breath, and honoring her and knowing that our bodies want to heal themselves, and it's our job to listen to what our body needs. So there's a lot of listening happening. If you think about it, your body talks to you all the time, only it's really slow. Your body speaks in senses and sensations. And a lot of us especially those that are PTSD or suffering from different mental health or illnesses, or those of us that have been told that they have a disease, a lot of those folks have a hard time going into their body. They have a hard time staying inside of their body because there's not been trust. There's not been trust in the different parts of ourselves. There's not been trust in knowing that my body is going to speak to me and sense and tell me something by the movement of the water in my body. I'm going to notice myself freezing, and my mind is going to diagnose or figure out why and assess. And then I'm going to feel what I need. I'm going to listen to the plant people. I'm going to listen to Mother's breath, and she's going to help me recover from this moment. You see, that's a lot of discipline, and that's a lot of trust. That's a lot of obedience to our natural protocol, to our natural laws. So thank you for asking that, because we did have an ultimate beautiful relationship with our plant people. We had an ultimate and beautiful relationship with ourselves, with our own bodies, and listening. So you can
Hey
say
everyone, I'm Manesh, the psychedelic scientist.
Whoa,
In this video, I'm going to be giving you some tips on...
Something else just came into my earbud, excuse me. Yeah, thank you for that, Solana. And here's a question from a woman named Gretchen Lawler. She kind of missed the last 5 points you said right at the end. She just asked if you could repeat them.
Yes, definitely. And no, thanks, Gretchen. I hope you're well. And so I was talking about trust, vulnerability, visibility, truth, and transparency. And thanks for asking, because I'm going to go over why just really quick. For Mother Earth and for ourselves, it's about preservation. It's about that partnership or that relationship. It's an invitation or a call to action. It's about reclaiming, and it's about the spirit. And we do that by acknowledging or accepting whatever event or trauma or circumstance that has happened. And then it's like building steps. So then we find our witness, our helper, or elder. And then we imagine that reconciliation of whatever event or experience or circumstance. And then we provide that service. So thanks for asking.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more question here. Excuse me. Well, and when I look at this question, I think you actually did a pretty good job of answering it already, but perhaps just a nice way to sum up, since this would be our last question. This is actually from Casey, excuse me, who is asking, why is trusting in the spirit so important for our survival?
That's a really good question. And I would invite you to consider, why are these particular plants, the psilocybin, the ayahuasca, the peyote, these plants that people call hallucinogenic plants or psychedelic or psychotropic plants, why do they do what they do to us? You see, they alter, or they get into our minds, they get into our emotions, they get into the physiological, spiritual part of ourselves. There's definitely a movement of that. And so if we don't decide to trust that movement, if we don't decide to acknowledge that power and that that relationship that the plant has all on its own, that Mother's breath carries and just has constantly, then there's no point. You see, there's no respect for even yourself, your highest self, the self that goes into that plant, the self that gets to see the sacred geometry, the self that is seeking those answers. Because it's not just your brain, it's not just your mind, it's not just your physical self that's moving you to these plants. It's something bigger.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for your inspiring words. And, you know, and just at the very end there, I flashed on, I don't know if I got the words right, but Chris Killam, in his upcoming book, The Lotus in the Bud, Chris will be speaking on Sunday, shared an old aphorism of some kind that goes something like this, that when the storm comes or when the gale comes, the spiritual warrior learns to ride the crest of it. And I believe that's what you're doing. And I thank you so much for your service. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you,
today. And it was
Solana.
great to
Yes.
see you guys again. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Spirit of Plant Medicine Conference.
Yay. Thank you.